I want to tell you something before I begin, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it. This is not a news report. This is not a headline. This is a story. And like all stories that matter, it is told because the feelings inside it are real, even when the names and the details belong to the telling. I am sharing this because somewhere out there, a mother is watching her daughter go quiet and telling herself it is just stress. Somewhere out there, a daughter is waiting for her mother to finally look at the right wall. And somewhere, in a house that looks perfectly fine from the outside, there is a door that has been locked from the inside for longer than anyone wants to admit. If that lands somewhere in your chest, then you are exactly who I am talking to tonight. My name is Marjorie Ellison. I am 76 years old, and I have lived at 308 Cedar Mill Road in Burlington, Iowa, for going on 31 years. The house is old, the way good things get old. The floors creak in the same 3 places they always have. The kitchen window lets in a particular kind of afternoon light that turns everything gold for about 20 minutes before the sun drops behind the Reinhardt property next door. The porch leans a little to the left, and I have never fixed it because I told myself I liked the way it felt like the house was resting its head on its hand, the way a tired woman does when she finally sits down. I raised my daughter Hannah in this house. I made her breakfast at that kitchen table. I watched her learn to read at the window seat by the living room. I tucked her in under a quilt my mother made, a blue and yellow quilt with tiny flowers that Hannah called the garden blanket because she said it smelled like outside even in winter. I want you to picture that blanket because I'm going to come back to it. I am going to come back to it because that blanket is part of how I finally understood what I had missed. I worked nights. For 20 years, I was a unit coordinator at Burlington Regional Medical, the overnight shift, 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning, 4 nights a week. I chose nights originally because the pay differential helped, and then I kept nights because the hospital felt different in the dark. Quieter, more honest in a way. People do not perform as much at 3 in the morning. They are too tired to pretend. I understood that kind of tired. I lived it. And I told myself that leaving Hannah at home was fine. She was not a child I was leaving. She was an adult woman living in her mother's house, which is a thing that happens in families and carries no shame. Hannah came back home at 27 after a difficult time with a relationship that ended badly, and I was grateful to have her near me. I liked hearing her move around in the kitchen when I came home in the mornings. I liked that there was someone to share coffee with before I slept. I thought I understood what was happening in my own house. I want to pause here and breathe for just a moment because I know some of you are already feeling something. Maybe it is recognition. Maybe it is that particular discomfort of a story that sounds a little too familiar. If you would do this old woman a kindness, take a second and tell me where you are watching from tonight. What city, what state, what time it is there where you are sitting. I like knowing I am not talking into an empty room. If this story is already touching something in you, leave a like so I know to keep going. And if you have not subscribed yet, I would be so grateful if you did. There is a new story here every day, and every one of them carries something worth holding on to. Now let me go back to Cedar Mill Road. Leonard Voss came into our lives 2 years after Hannah moved back home. He was 54 years old, methodical, courteous, and employed as a residential security technician. He installed alarm systems, replaced door locks, set up cameras for people who were worried about their properties. He had a business card that said Security Solutions and a handshake that people described as firm and trustworthy. My neighbor Patricia Reeves introduced us at a 4th of July gathering she hosted on her back lawn, and I remember thinking he had kind eyes. That is what I remember thinking. Kind eyes. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that I was not a foolish woman. I was not naive or careless. I was a woman who looked at someone and saw what he had practiced showing. Leonard moved into the house on Cedar Mill Road 14 months after Patricia introduced us. He and I had a quiet civil ceremony at the county clerk's office, just Hannah and Patricia as witnesses, and I wore a cream blouse I bought at the consignment shop on Jefferson Street that Hannah said made me look like a woman who had already figured out the important things. I thought that was the sweetest thing she could have said. I did not yet understand that she was already watching him carefully while I was still deciding what to believe. The changes in Hannah were not dramatic at first. I want to be clear about that because I think a lot of people expect trouble to arrive loudly. They expect a daughter to come to them crying or shouting or with obvious evidence of something wrong. Hannah did none of those things. What Hannah did was smaller and slower and far easier to explain away. She stopped singing in the kitchen. That might sound like a minor thing, but Hannah had always sung while she cooked. Old songs, quiet ones, hymns sometimes, pop songs from when she was in high school. She did not have a beautiful voice, but she used it freely, the way people do when they feel safe. Then, one autumn, the singing stopped, and when I noticed and mentioned it, she smiled and said she had not been in a musical mood lately. I told myself that was a fine explanation. People go through phases. She started asking me what time I was leaving for work before she used to. Not urgently, just conversationally, just woven into dinner talk. "What time is your shift tonight, Mom? Are you working tomorrow night too?" I thought she was being considerate, planning her evenings the way adults do when they share a space. I did not notice how the question changed in texture over time, how it began to sound less like planning and more like counting. She began taking her coffee up to her room more often. We used to sit at the kitchen table together every morning when I came home and she was waking up. It was our overlap time, the hour that belonged to both of us. Then slowly, she started saying she was tired and would take her cup upstairs. I missed our mornings, but I told myself she was growing into her own routines. Adults change. Adults need their space. I was careful not to crowd her. She stopped talking to her friend Brenda on the phone. Brenda had been Hannah's best friend since middle school, one of those friendships that endures every kind of distance and difficulty. Then suddenly Brenda's name stopped coming up, and when I asked, Hannah said they had drifted. I thought of my own old friendships and how life pulls people apart, and I let it go. I let it go. I want you to hear how many times I let something go. The garden blanket disappeared from Hannah's room. I noticed it one afternoon when I was straightening her doorway and saw her bed without it. When I asked, she said it was too warm for it now. It was October in Iowa. It was not too warm for anything. I did not see the pattern because I was seeing each change as its own small thing. I did not lay them side by side. I did not ask myself what they had in common. I want to tell you, because it is the first important thing this story has to teach, that isolation does not look like a locked room. It looks like small adjustments. It looks like a woman rearranging her life in ways that each seem perfectly reasonable, but that together describe a cage that was built one quiet bar at a time. Leonard was, in every visible way, a considerate man. He brought in the groceries. He fixed the gutter. He remembered birthdays and complimented my cooking and never raised his voice. My sister Dovie called him a keeper. Patricia said she was happy for me. The men at my church shook his hand and said I had done well. He was so thoroughly pleasant in public that I began to think if anything was wrong in the house, it must be coming from somewhere inside me. Some old fear, some resistance to happiness, some stubborn widow grief I had not finished processing. That is another thing I need to tell you, because it matters. When a person is skilled at appearing trustworthy, they do not just deceive other people. They make you doubt your own reading of a room. They make you wonder whether your instincts are problems rather than information. I had good instincts. I had 20 years of hospital nights sharpening them. And still I talked myself out of them over and over because the story he presented was so consistent and the discomfort I felt had no evidence I could point to. Until the night of October 17th. I want to stop here for just a breath. If you have ever been in a moment where your instincts were telling you something and someone very calm told you that you were imagining it, write the word listen in the comments. Just the word listen. Because I believe someone watching tonight knows exactly what I am describing, and I want them to know that a 76-year-old woman from Burlington, Iowa is here telling them they were not imagining it. Keep that comment coming. Tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is there. I will be right back in this story, and the next part is the part that changed everything. It was 2:46 in the morning, and I know the time exactly because I have gone back to it so many times that it has become a number I carry like a stone in my pocket. I was sleeping. I had come off a shift at 11 the night before, one of those short turnaround nights that leaves the body confused about what it is supposed to do. I was in that particular deep sleep you fall into when you are not quite recovered, the kind where you do not dream, just go dark. Hannah opened my bedroom door so quietly that what woke me was not the sound, but the change in the air. That is the only way I can describe it. Something in the room shifted, the way a room feels different when a window is opened, and I came up out of the dark and opened my eyes, and she was standing in the doorway. She had her hand raised toward me, index finger against her lips, even before I could say her name. Not a panicked gesture, a deliberate one. And her face was not the face of a frightened woman. It was the face of a woman who had been planning something for a long time and had finally decided the time had come to do it. That distinction matters. Fear and decision can look similar from a distance, but they feel entirely different in a room at 2:46 in the morning. She crossed to my bedside and leaned down close to my ear, and she spoke barely above a breath. She said, "Mom, come with me to the basement. Don't turn on the hallway light. And please, don't ask me if I'm sure. I want to tell you what that last part did to me. Don't ask me if I'm sure." My daughter had anticipated that I would ask her that. She had prepared for it, which meant she had been thinking about this conversation long enough to rehearse it, long enough to know my instincts, long enough to predict my doubt. That is not the thought of a woman who woke up with a sudden idea. That is the thought of a woman who had been waiting for the right moment for a very long time. I got up without turning on any light. I followed her out of the bedroom and down the hall in the dark, my hand trailing the wall the way I have done 1,000 times in this old house, knowing every bump and crack of the plaster by touch. Leonard's breathing in the room behind me was even and slow, or it sounded even and slow. I have thought about that many times since, whether he was truly sleeping or whether he was listening. We went down the basement stairs. The basement of the house on Cedar Mill Road is the kind of basement old Iowa houses come with, low-ceilinged, concrete-floored, smelling of mineral water and decades of stored things. My husband Walter, Hannah's father, used to keep his woodworking tools down there before he passed. After Walter died, I could not bring myself to clear the space fully, so his old workbench was still against the east wall, and stacked beside it was the accumulation of years. Paint cans with dried rims, boxes of Christmas things, a broken dehumidifier I kept meaning to take to the recycler, and along the south wall, an old metal shelving unit I had put up years ago to hold canned goods and overflow pantry items. Hannah went straight to the shelving unit. She did not hesitate. She put both hands on the left edge of the unit and pulled, and it swung outward on a hinge I had not known was there. And behind it was a section of the basement wall that I had looked at without seeing for 2 years. She handed me a small flashlight she had been holding in her sleeve, the kind that fits in a palm, and she pointed the beam at a section of the lower wall. She said, "Break that part." She handed me Walter's old short-handled hammer from the workbench, and I took it in both hands, and I looked at my daughter's face in the thin beam of the flashlight, and I understood that she had been carrying this moment alone for a very long time, and that what she needed from me now was not questions. What she needed was for me to do the thing she was asking. I swung the hammer. The first strike opened a crack. The second opened a section. What I found behind that wall was not something grotesque, not something visually violent or disturbing. What I found was far worse in a different way, the way that quiet things are always worse than loud ones, because they have had more time to do their work undisturbed. There was a shallow cavity in the wall, perhaps 18 inches wide and 2 feet tall, neatly edged, clearly constructed with intention. Inside it, arranged with the precise organization of a person who thinks in systems, were the following things: A digital audio recorder, small and black, the kind used for meeting notes, with several cartridge-sized memory cards beside it. A coil of slender cable, the kind used in low-profile installation work. A small spiral-bound notebook with a black cover. A ring with 4 keys on it, none of which I recognized. A manila envelope folded once and held closed with a rubber band. And behind everything, fitted into the back corner, a portable hard drive no larger than a deck of playing cards. I stood there in the basement of my own house at 2:46 in the morning, and I looked at what my husband had built inside my walls, and I could not speak. Hannah's voice came from behind me, barely above silence. She said, "Now you know why I used to shake when he talked about keeping us safe. If you are still with me, take a breath. Because what I found in that wall was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of understanding what the story had actually been all along. Stay with me. Tell me where you are watching from right now. What city are you in? What time is it there? If this is affecting you, leave a like. Subscribe if you want the rest of this story and a new one tomorrow. I am not going anywhere, and neither is this story. We are only just beginning. I was born in 1948 in a farmhouse outside of Mediapolis, Iowa, to parents who did not talk about trouble until it had already gone all the way through the house and out the other side. That is the way people were built in that part of the world in those years. You endured. You prayed. You put your head down and you carried what was yours to carry. My mother had a saying she used whenever something difficult arrived in the family. She would say, "We do not make noise about what we cannot yet name." I grew up believing that was wisdom. I now understand it was also a form of protection that sometimes worked and sometimes left the door open too long. I want to tell you about the woman I was before the night in the basement, because I think it matters for understanding how a woman with good instincts can still take too long to trust them. I am not telling you to excuse myself. I am telling you so that if you recognize yourself in this story, you understand that being intelligent and being deceived are not opposites. They can live in the same person at the same time, and the shame of that is not yours to carry. I married Walter Ellison in 1972, a quiet, steady man who worked at the feed supply warehouse off Agency Road and spent his evenings in the basement with his woodworking and his radio programs. Walter was not a demonstrative man, but he was a trustworthy one, and there is a kind of love built on trust that feels less romantic than the songs make it sound, but holds together in ways that passion does not always manage. We had Hannah in 1993, later than most of our friends started their families, and Walter said she was the proof that patience paid off in the end. He died in 2014 from a heart event that happened too fast for goodbyes. I missed him the way you miss a reliable piece of architecture, the kind that has been holding something up so quietly that you do not realize how much it was carrying until it is gone. After Walter died, I went back to full-time at the hospital, and I threw myself into the work the way grieving people do when they need a reason to get dressed and leave the house. I made good friends at Burlington Regional, women who understood the night shift rhythm, who brought good food to share at 3 in the morning, who knew how to hold a difficult moment with a patient's family and then go home and sleep and come back and do it again. I was good at my job. I was precise and observant, and I had what the charge nurses called floor instincts, the ability to sense when something was about to change in a patient before the monitors showed it. I trusted that instinct completely at work. I want to think about why I did not trust it at home. I have had 2 years to think about this, and what I have come to understand is that our instincts are often best calibrated where we have practiced using them most. At the hospital, I had 20 years of feedback. I noticed something, I acted, and the outcome confirmed or corrected my read. At home, in my private life, I had spent decades not making noise about what I could not yet name. I had practiced quieting those instincts in domestic spaces, and Leonard knew that. I do not know how he knew it so precisely, but people who manipulate other people are often very skilled readers of what others have learned to suppress. Now let me tell you about Hannah before Leonard came into the house, because I want you to understand what normal looked like, really looked like, before I describe what changed. Hannah was a bright, slightly anxious woman who compensated for her anxiety with humor and practical organization. She kept lists. She color-coded her calendar. She texted me good morning every day without fail, even if we had seen each other at breakfast. She called Brenda on Sundays, and I would hear her laughing from the kitchen. Big, easy laughs, the kind that start in the belly. She baked when she was stressed, elaborate things, layer cakes and braided breads, and the kitchen would smell of butter and warm sugar. She started every project 3 times before she was satisfied with it. She was meticulous about the garden, protective of her tomatoes, annoyed by the rabbits, and happy in the dirt, in a way that she said felt like being in conversation with something patient. She was not a woman who hid things. She was not a woman who had perfected silence. She was a woman who had been pushed toward it by a process so gradual and so carefully managed that by the time I noticed the change, years of it had already happened. I need you to stay right here with me for a moment, because this is the part of the story where I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone you love become quieter and told yourself it was just their personality or their mood or their age, and then later understood that the quiet was actually an answer to something you never thought to ask? If that has happened in your life, tell me in the comments. Just write the word still, because that is what Hannah had become. Still. The way water goes still when something heavy has been placed on top of it. And if this story is reaching you, please leave a like. Subscribe for tomorrow's story, because there is something here every day, and some of them are about exactly this. Now I am going to tell you what I began to notice in the 14 months before October 17th. I told you about the singing, and the coffee, and the garden blanket. But there were other things I did not name out loud even to myself until later. Hannah began over-explaining small things. If she had gone to the grocery store while I was sleeping, she would tell me exactly where she went, exactly what she bought, exactly how long she was gone, in a way that had the texture of a report more than a conversation. I thought she was being considerate. I understand now that she had been trained to preemptively account for her time. She stopped having opinions about where to eat when I suggested going out for dinner. Hannah had always had opinions about food. She liked the Thai place on Jefferson, but not the other one. She always ordered the soup at Donnelly's Diner before she looked at anything else. Then suddenly she would say, "Whatever you want, Mom, wherever you want to go." Deference that fine-grained is not contentment. It is practiced erasure. She began apologizing for things that were not mistakes. She apologized for her laugh being too loud. She apologized for asking me to turn down the television. She apologized for taking the last of the orange juice. Small, constant apologies that had the rhythm of a person who had been told repeatedly that their presence was an imposition. And here is the thing I find hardest to say. I noticed all of these things. I noticed each one. I filed them away in the part of my mind that notices, and I did not connect them to each other, and I did not name what they together described, and I did not ask the direct question. I told myself I was respecting her privacy. I told myself she was an adult. I told myself that mothers of adult daughters have to be careful not to hover, not to project, not to see trouble where there is only life being lived differently than you expected it to be. I was right about all of that in principle, and I used that rightness as a reason not to see what was happening in front of me. I want to tell you now what I found in the notebook from inside the wall, because this is where the story turns from suspicion into documentation. And documentation is one of the most important concepts I'm going to ask you to carry with you when you leave this story today. The notebook was small, black-covered, spiral-bound at the top, the kind you find in any office supply aisle for $2. Leonard's handwriting was precise and small, the handwriting of someone who had been trained in technical work, everything printed in clear block letters, nothing wasted. The first pages were a schedule. My schedule. Every shift I had worked for the past 8 months was recorded, with the date written out in full and the hours noted. The nights I left. The nights I had off. The nights I came home early. The nights I called to say I was staying for a double shift. Below each entry was a note. Sometimes it was a single line. Sometimes it was a paragraph. The notes described what Hannah had done in the house during those hours, where she went, who she talked to, what she said on the phone, when she came downstairs, when she went back up, whether she cried, whether she ate. I had to sit down on the basement floor when I read that. On the cold concrete floor of the house where my daughter had lived her whole life, I sat down and I read what had been recorded about her while I was at work keeping strangers alive through the night. One entry read, Hannah on phone with Brenda approximately 40 minutes. Discussed visit. Told her it was not a good time. Brenda asked questions. Hannah ended call early. Confirmed conversation with H later. She agreed the friendship had become too intense. The word confirmed made my hands cold. He had not just listened to that conversation. He had then spoken to Hannah about it in a way that caused her to agree with his framing of it. He had used what he heard to shape what she believed. That is not eavesdropping. That is architecture. Another entry, dated the previous February. Hannah expressed concern about Mom noticing changes. Reminded her that Marjorie works nights and is often tired and reads situations incorrectly. Reinforced that if Hannah were to voice concerns to Marjorie, it would be processed through Marjorie's anxiety and made worse. H agreed that keeping things calm was better for everyone. There I was, in his notebook. He had used my name. He had described my limits. He had taken my own tendencies, my tiredness, my worry, my imperfect history of not asking the right questions, and built them into a wall between my daughter and me. He had not needed to forbid Hannah from talking to me. He had convinced her that talking to me would hurt both of us. That is the kind of manipulation that takes patience and intelligence, and it is the kind that leaves almost no trace in the outside world because it happens entirely in the space of a person's beliefs about themselves and the people they love. I want to stop right here because I need to breathe, and I suspect some of you do too. If you have ever had your own words or your own weaknesses used against someone you love without your knowledge, write the word seen in the comments. You were seen. What happened in your house was real. And if someone near you is going through something that keeps getting dismissed because the person causing harm seems so reasonable in public, please share this story with them. It might give them the word for what they are living through. Leave a like, subscribe. Tell me where you are right now and what time it is. I am going to keep going because the story is not done and neither is the lesson. When I stood up from the basement floor, Hannah was sitting on the bottom step watching me. She had her knees pulled to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, the same way she used to sit as a small girl when she was waiting for something. I looked at her and I felt something move through me that I do not have a clean name for. It was love, and it was grief, and it was the particular shame of a woman who had trusted her own story about her house more than she had listened to the story her daughter was living inside it. I said, "How long have you known about this?" She said, "I found the recording equipment 8 months ago. I did not know about the notebook until 3 weeks ago. I saw him go to the wall when he thought I was in the shower." I said, "Why did you wait?" She looked at me for a long time before she answered. She said, "Because every time I thought about telling you, I heard his voice in my head telling me you would worry too much and make things worse, and that I was being dramatic. And then I would hear your voice agreeing with him, because he had shown me conversations you two had, where you said things like, 'Hannah tends to read too much into situations.' And I could not tell anymore which of those voices was actually yours. I am going to need you to sit with that for a moment. My daughter had recordings of my own voice, taken without my knowledge, edited into a portrait of me as someone who dismissed her, and played back to her enough times that she had started to believe it. He had not turned Hannah against me. He had made Hannah doubt whether the real me was someone who would help her. That is psychological control at its most precise. It does not use loud threats. It uses the people you love most as instruments of your own isolation. It builds the prison out of the relationships that should have been the exits. I want to be honest with you about something important before I go further, because this story has educational weight and I want to carry it carefully. What I am describing is a recognizable pattern in situations involving coercive control. It has names in professional literature. There are counselors, social workers, advocates, and legal professionals who are trained specifically to identify and respond to it. I am a grandmother from Burlington, Iowa, and I know what I saw and lived, but the lesson I most want to leave you with here is this. If something in your house feels like what I am describing, you do not need to wait until you have physical proof. You do not need to build a case alone. You need one trusted person and one first step, and those two things together are enough to begin. Hannah and I sat in the basement for 2 hours that night, not making a plan yet, just sitting with what was true. She told me about small moments over the past 2 years, moments I remembered differently now that I knew the context for them. A dinner where I had said, "Leonard, Hannah seems a little worried lately," and he had said, "She's been having a hard time with some friends," and I had accepted that explanation without ever asking Hannah directly. A Sunday when I had noticed Hannah did not look well and had asked if she was all right, and she had said she was fine, and I had looked at Leonard and he had given me a small nod, like a confirmation, like he was the translator of my daughter's emotional state, and I had let him be that. I had let him be the interpreter of my own child, and I had not seen it because the interpretation was always delivered so calmly, so helpfully, so in the register of a man who just wanted everyone to be comfortable. The garden blanket was on a shelf in the back corner of the basement. Hannah had brought it down herself the previous spring, she said, because he had told her it was taking up too much space in her room and the color was too busy for the bed. She had not wanted to throw it away. She had not been able to keep it where she slept. So she had put it where it would at least still be in the house, in the dark, on a basement shelf, waiting. When I found it there, I held it for a long time. It smelled of the cedar block I keep in the linen area, not of outdoors anymore, not of the warmth Hannah's body had put into it through all the years she had slept under it. But it was still the garden blanket. It was still my mother's work, still the tiny flowers, still the blue and yellow that Hannah had loved since she was small enough to disappear under it entirely. I folded it over my arm, and I looked at my daughter, and I said, "We are going to fix this. I do not know yet exactly how, but we are going to fix this." She said, "I know. That is why I woke you up." I have lived long enough to know that the hardest conversations are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes the hardest conversation is the one you have with yourself at 4 in the morning in a basement, holding a quilt your mother made, trying to figure out how much of what you believed about your own home was true, and how much of it was a version of the truth that someone else had been carefully maintaining for you. That is where I was on the morning of October 18th. Not angry yet, not strategic yet, just sitting inside the wreckage of a story I had told myself for 2 years and trying to find what was actually solid underneath it. I want to tell you what I did in the hours after Hannah showed me the wall, because I think the way a person moves in the immediate aftermath of a revelation like that tells you something important about who they are and what they have learned from their years. I did not wake Leonard. I did not confront him in the dark. I did not do the thing that every part of my adrenaline was screaming at me to do, which was to walk up those stairs and stand in the doorway of my own bedroom and demand an accounting. I did not do that because Hannah put her hand on my arm when she saw me start toward the stairs, and she said, "Mom, not yet, please." And I heard in those 2 words the full weight of a woman who had been thinking about this longer than I had, who understood the situation more completely than I did in that moment, and who needed me to trust her read of it the way she had finally trusted mine. So I sat back down. I put the garden blanket across both our laps the way I used to do when she was small, and we would sit on the porch on cold autumn mornings, and we made a plan. Not a perfect plan. Not a final plan, but the beginning of one, and sometimes that is all you need to keep from making things worse in the dark. The first thing Hannah said was that she needed us to leave before he woke up, or at least to have everything we needed out of the basement before he was downstairs. She had been thinking about this for 3 weeks, since the day she saw him go to the wall. She had been noting things, quietly, in her own way. She had a small zippered bag she had packed and repacked 4 times already, stored behind the water heater. It had her identification documents, her medications, her phone charger, the photographs she could not leave behind, and a small amount of cash she had been setting aside from the grocery money over several months, a few dollars at a time, folded into a pocket of her winter coat. I want you to hear that. My daughter had been leaving herself a door for months before she could walk through it. She did not know exactly when she would need it, but she kept it ready, and that readiness was one of the bravest and most practical things I have ever seen a person do for themselves. I have thought about it many times since, about the kind of quiet courage it takes to prepare for an exit when you are not yet sure you will survive asking for one. We took the memory cards, the notebook, the envelope, and the hard drive from the wall cavity. Hannah had a bag for them, a plain canvas tote she had also stored behind the water heater. We left the recorder in place and the cavity open, not closed, because I wanted what was behind that wall to be exactly as we found it when the time came for someone other than us to see it. I replaced the shelving unit against the wall, but did not latch it. Hannah turned off her flashlight, and we went back upstairs in the dark. Leonard's breathing was still even when I passed the bedroom door. We sat in Hannah's room until first light came through the window, speaking in the low register that people use when they do not want sound to carry through walls. And Hannah told me things she had not been able to say out loud before, not because she lacked words for them, but because she had been living inside a version of the house where saying them felt dangerous. She told me that in the early months of Leonard's presence in the house, she had noticed small things that bothered her, but had no framework for. Doors that she thought she had closed were open when she returned to a room. Her phone, which she kept face down on her desk, was sometimes face up when she came back to it. A conversation she had with me in the kitchen one evening was referenced the next morning by Leonard in a way that was too specific to be coincidence, details she had not shared with him. The name of a co-worker I had mentioned, the problem I had described with a particular piece of equipment at the hospital. She said she had told herself she was misremembering. She said she had told herself she was being paranoid. She said he had helped her tell herself that. When she mentioned to him that she felt sometimes like conversations were being repeated back to her, he had listened with great patience and then said gently that stress can do that the brain under pressure starts to notice patterns where there are none, and that it was understandable given how much she had been through with her previous relationship. He had taken her legitimate perception and renamed it a symptom of her own history. That is the thing I want you to understand, because it is the most important educational piece I carry from this whole experience. Coercive control does not always announce itself with restriction or threats. Sometimes it announces itself with explanation, with calm reframing, with a patient voice that says your discomfort is your own misreading of reality. And the more reasonable the voice sounds, the harder it is to trust your own. Before I go on, I need to take a breath and check in with you, because we are in deep water now, and I want to make sure you are still with me. If you are listening to this in the morning with your coffee, or in the evening after the house has gone quiet, or in the middle of the night the way I used to read on the nights I could not sleep, tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is. If this story is giving you language for something you have witnessed or lived, please leave a like. Share this with someone who might need the words. Subscribe if you want to sit with me again tomorrow, because I have more stories and every one of them is told for a reason. Now let me tell you what happened when the sun came up on October 18th. I went to Leonard at 7 in the morning, which was his normal waking time, and I said nothing about the basement. I made coffee. I set a cup on the counter where he always took it. I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at the man I had married, and I felt the strangest double vision, the way you can look at a room you have lived in for years and suddenly see it as a stranger would, noticing things that familiarity had made invisible. I saw how he arranged himself in the kitchen, how he positioned himself between Hannah and the back door without appearing to do it deliberately, how his eyes tracked her movements while his face remained perfectly pleasant. I had always thought of him as attentive. I understood now what his attention actually was. I told him I was going to visit my sister Dovie in Keokuk for a few days. Dovie was real. The visit was not. I said Hannah would come with me because Dovey had been asking to see her, which was true in a general sense, though there was no specific plan. I watched his face. I watched the calculation behind the pleasantness. He said that sounded lovely and asked when we were leaving, and I said that afternoon, and he nodded and said he would manage fine and to give Dovey his regards. He did not try to stop us. He did not object or question or find reasons it was inconvenient. And that measured non-resistance told me something important. He was not worried because he did not believe we knew what was in the wall. He believed his construction was intact, and that belief was the gap between us, and I intended to use it. Hannah and I left Cedar Mill Road at 2 p.m. with 3 bags between us, the canvas tote from the basement included. We drove not to Keokuk, but to the home of Patricia Reeves, my neighbor of 11 years, who had introduced me to Leonard Voss at a 4th of July gathering, and who had, in the months since, noticed changes in both Hannah and me that she had not known how to name. Patricia opened her door before I finished knocking. She took one look at my face and stepped aside and said, "Come in, Marjorie. Tell me everything." I want to talk about Patricia for a moment because she is part of the lesson too. Patricia was 72 years old, and she lived alone, and she paid attention to her street in the way that older people who live alone often do, not nosily, but carefully, the way a person does when they understand that community is a form of safety. She had seen Leonard come and go at precise hours. She had noticed that Hannah, who used to wave from the front porch and stop to chat across the fence, had stopped doing both of those things. She had mentioned it to me once, casually, and I had said that Hannah was going through a quieter period, and Patricia had accepted that, but had kept watching. When I laid everything on Patricia's kitchen table, the memory cards, the notebook, the envelope, the hard drive, Patricia sat across from me and read and listened for an hour and a half without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I knew something was wrong. I did not know what shape it had. I am sorry I did not push harder." I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I said I was the one who lived in the house, and I was the one who had not seen it clearly enough or fast enough, and she said, "Marjorie, we are both going to set that down now, because self-blame is the luxury of people who have time for it, and right now, what you need is a plan." Patricia was a retired school counselor, 31 years working with children and families in Burlington's public schools. She understood documentation. She understood the language of concern. She understood how to help someone make a first step that could not be undone. She took out a notepad and she said, "First thing tomorrow morning, you are going to the Burlington Police Department. Not tonight, because tonight we need you to rest, and I need to copy what is in this tote into an organized format that the officer behind the desk can actually follow. You are not walking in there with a notebook and a hard drive and emotion. You are walking in there with a clear, dated, documented account. That is how you get taken seriously." I listened to Patricia the way I should have listened to my own instincts months earlier. Sometimes the help you need is not the help you imagined. I had thought that finding the truth would be the hard part. I had not understood that presenting the truth in a way that a system could receive it was its own separate skill. That night in Patricia's guest room, I lay in the dark with the garden blanket across the foot of the bed where Hannah had put it, and I thought about Walter. I thought about how he would have looked at all of this. Walter was not a complicated man, but he was a just one. And I think he would have put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You saw it when she needed you to. That is what matters now." I chose to believe that. I needed something to hold. Let me tell you what we found in the manila envelope, because it is the detail that shifted everything from documentation of surveillance into something with clear legal dimension. Inside the envelope were copies of documents, not originals. Copies, which meant originals existed somewhere. There were copies of Hannah's bank statements going back 23 months. There were copies of correspondence between Hannah and her previous therapist, which Hannah had not consented to share with anyone and which should have been impossible for Leonard to access. There was a printed copy of an email Hannah had sent to her friend Brenda that contained personal disclosures about her mental health, disclosures Hannah said she had never discussed with Leonard and had not known he had read. And there was one document that I still have difficulty describing without feeling the cold move back into my hands. It was a single page, handwritten by Leonard, a list of what he called talking points, organized under Hannah's name, with notes on how to handle various conversational scenarios. How to respond if Hannah mentioned feeling watched. How to redirect if she brought up wanting to visit Brenda. How to reframe if she mentioned feeling like her memory was poor. Each point was written as an instruction to himself, a script for managing her perception of her own reality. The word I keep returning to when I think about that page is deliberate. Everything in that wall had been deliberate. The surveillance was deliberate. The documentation was deliberate. The isolation was deliberate. The management of Hannah's self-perception was deliberate. This was not a man who had stumbled into harmful behavior through carelessness or emotional immaturity. This was a man who had constructed a system and operated it with the focused patience of a professional. He had, after all, spent his career building systems designed to monitor and control spaces. He had simply applied that expertise to a different kind of space. I need you to stay with me right now, because I am going to tell you about the morning we went to the police, and I want you to understand both what went right and what was difficult, because I think the truth of these situations demands honesty about both. If you are watching this and you know someone who is trying to figure out how to take a first step out of a situation that feels too tangled to address, please share this story with them. Write "reach" in the comments. Tell me you are here. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. Leave a like if this is giving you something useful. Subscribe so you are here for the rest of it. I am going right back to the story now, and the next part is where things begin to move. Patricia drove Hannah and me to the Burlington Police Department on the morning of October 19th. Patricia had spent the previous evening creating what she called a summary document, 3 pages, dated and organized, with a clear timeline and a simple description of each item in the canvas tote and its significance. She had also written a brief cover note explaining her own professional background and her direct observations as a neighbor. She had done this without drama, with the methodical care of a woman who understood that emotion is real and evidence is what the system can act on. The officer at the desk was a young man named Davies, and I want to be fair to him even though our first conversation was not easy. He was polite. He was not dismissive in the way I had feared, but he was also uncertain, because what we were describing was not a straightforward crime with an obvious category. Surveillance in a residence you share with someone, even when conducted without consent, exists in complicated legal territory that varies by jurisdiction and circumstance. He asked us several careful questions. He took the memory cards. He took the summary document. He told us that a detective would review the material and be in contact. I walked out of that police station feeling something I was not prepared for, which was not relief, but flatness. A kind of exhausted deflation that comes when you have been carrying something enormous and you finally set it down and your arms do not know what to do with the absence of weight. Patricia put her hand through my arm in the parking lot and said, "That is what the first step feels like. It does not feel like victory. It feels like having done it." She was right. And she was right about something else she had told me the night before, which was that the first step is almost never the last step, and that expecting the system to move as fast as your fear would only lead to disappointment. Real protection is built in stages: documentation, then disclosure, then professional review, then the slow work of whatever comes after. No single conversation fixes what years have constructed. What I did not know yet, standing in that parking lot on a cool October morning in Burlington, Iowa, was that the contents of those memory cards would reveal something larger than the surveillance of one woman in one house. Leonard Voss had done this before. Not in our house. Before our house. In a house in another state, belonging to a woman who had also married a quiet, competent, trustworthy-seeming man who installed security systems and understood how to use knowledge as control. That woman had not been able to get anyone to listen in time. I did not know that yet, but I would. And Hannah, sitting in the back seat of Patricia's car with the garden blanket across her lap because Patricia had insisted she bring something familiar, was quiet the whole drive home. Not the frightened quiet of the previous 2 years. A different quiet. The quiet of a person who has finally put something down and is feeling the relief of their own empty hands. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. It does not raise its voice. It does not make speeches. It sits in a police station waiting room on a plastic chair and fills out paperwork with hands that are not entirely steady. And it drives home afterward and makes soup because something has to be made for dinner. And soup is the thing that feels most like care when care is all you have to give. That is the kind of courage Hannah and I practiced in the weeks that followed October 19th. And I want to tell you about it precisely, because I think it is the kind of courage that most people need most of the time, and it almost never gets named as such. Leonard came home on the evening of October 18th to a house with 3 fewer bags in it, and a note on the kitchen counter that said simply that Hannah and I had gone to Dovey's and would be in touch. He sent me a text message at 9:17 that evening that said, "Hope you and Hannah have a good visit. Let me know if you need anything. Kiss Dovey for me." I read that message standing in Patricia's kitchen, and I felt a particular chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The message was exactly correct. It was the message a concerned husband would send. It was calibrated. And that calibration, that absolute precision of appropriate response, told me more about what I was dealing with than anything else he could have said. I did not respond. Patricia advised me not to, at least not until we had spoken with the detective who would be reviewing the material, and I followed that advice because Patricia had 31 years of counseling experience, and I had 1 night of raw revelation. And when those 2 things are in the same room, you listen to the 31 years. The detective assigned to our case was a woman named Alvarez, and I want to tell you about her because she matters to this story, and because she represents something important about what happens when the right person is in the right position. She called me 2 days after we had been to the station. She had reviewed the memory cards. She had looked at the notebook. She had read Patricia's summary document. She spoke to me for 45 minutes on the phone, and she asked questions that told me she understood exactly what she was looking at, not because the law had a single clean label for it yet in our jurisdiction, but because she had seen this kind of documentation before in other cases, and she knew what the pattern meant. She asked me about Leonard's professional history. She asked me whether he had access to any accounts in my name. She asked me whether I had noticed anything unusual about the home alarm system he had installed when he moved in, the one I had assumed was a standard residential setup. She asked me whether I had ever felt that my phone conversations were being monitored from within the house network. I told her about the alarm system. Leonard had installed it himself, naturally, because that was his work, and I had been grateful, because it meant I did not pay installation costs, and the system was, by his description, top of the line. He had walked me through the interface once, shown me how to arm and disarm it, shown me the camera views for the front and back doors. I had accepted that tour as complete. I had not thought to ask what else the system might include. Detective Alvarez asked me whether I would consent to having a technical specialist look at the system, someone from her department who understood residential security infrastructure. I said yes, without hesitation. She said she would also want to speak with Hannah directly, at a time and place where Hannah felt entirely safe, and that there was no urgency to rush that conversation, but that what Hannah knew and had observed would be important. I want to stop here and tell you something about what I was learning during those weeks, something that I think carries real value beyond this particular story. When I had first sat in the basement with Hannah and looked at what was inside that wall, my instinct had been to act immediately, to confront, to demand, to move. And I understand that instinct because it comes from love and from the specific horror of realizing that someone you trusted had been building something harmful inside your walls. But immediate action driven by that kind of distress is almost never the safest action. It can alert the person causing harm that they have been discovered before protective steps are in place. It can result in evidence being removed or destroyed. It can put vulnerable people in a more dangerous position than the one they were already in. Patience in these situations is not passivity. It is a form of protection. And it is one of the hardest things to practice when you are frightened and angry and have been living inside someone else's carefully constructed story. If someone near you is in a situation that involves this kind of control and you want to help them, please hear this. The most important things you can do are listen without pushing, help them feel safe enough to take their own first step, and connect them with people who have professional experience navigating exactly this kind of situation. In Iowa, as in most states, there are advocacy organizations with trained staff who understand coercive control and can help a person think through their options safely. A story like mine can give courage, but real safety is built with real support from people who know the specific terrain. I need to pause and check in with you right now, because what we are carrying in this story is heavy and important, and I do not want to carry it alone. If you are still here, if you have sat with me through every part of this, I am grateful to you in a way I cannot fully express. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. Tell me what time it is there. If this story is giving you something, leave a like. Subscribe if you want another one tomorrow, because I have them and I will keep telling them. And if this story is landing near something real in your life or someone you love, please share it. Write the word open in the comments. Not because it is a magic word, but because sometimes saying a thing out loud is the beginning of a door that can be walked through. Now let me tell you what the specialist found in the alarm system. The technical specialist came to Cedar Mill Road on the morning of October 22nd. Leonard was not in the house. Detective Alvarez had timed the visit with care. I had texted Leonard the previous evening, finally responding to his messages, and told him that I needed a few more days at Dovey's because she was not feeling well. He had replied with appropriate concern. He did not come to the house. The specialist, a younger man named Torres, who worked with the county's digital forensics unit, spent 4 hours in the house. I sat in the kitchen with Patricia, who had insisted on coming, and I drank more coffee than was good for me and looked at the afternoon light turning golden through the window and thought about Walter's hands, which had built the shelves in that kitchen and laid the tile by the back door and patched the ceiling in the upstairs hallway. And I thought that the house on Cedar Mill Road deserved to be clean again. Torres came into the kitchen at 2:30 with a tablet and a careful expression. He explained what he had found in the language of a professional who is trying to be precise without causing alarm, and I will translate it for you into plain words. The alarm system Leonard had installed was not a standard residential system. It included components that were not part of any legitimate consumer package, components that extended the system's monitoring capability to interior spaces, including audio monitoring of the kitchen, the living room, and the upstairs hallway. The feeds from these components were not stored locally. They were routed through the home network to an external account that Leonard could access remotely. He had been listening to my house for 2 years, not just watching the doors and the driveway, listening to conversations in rooms where Hannah and I talked about our days, our worries, our lives, listening to phone calls made from the landline in the kitchen, listening to everything that happened in the domestic heart of the house while he was sitting in a truck outside a client's property with a phone in his hand. I want to be precise about what I felt when Torres told me that, because I think it is important to name it accurately. I did not feel violated in the dramatic way stories usually describe. I felt something quieter and more pervasive. I felt the retroactive unreality of 2 years of conversations, the sense that every word I had spoken in my own kitchen had existed simultaneously in 2 places, once as a private thing said between people who lived together, and once as data in someone else's account. Every reassurance I had given Hannah. Every time I had said, Leonard seems to genuinely care. Every time I had said, maybe you are being a little hard on him. All of it heard and potentially used. Torres also examined Leonard's professional records through channels Detective Alvarez had opened, and here is where the story expanded beyond Cedar Mill Road in the way I had not yet fully anticipated. Leonard Voss had been licensed as a residential security technician in 3 states over the previous 11 years. Iowa, prior to that Nebraska, and prior to that Kansas. In Nebraska, there was a civil complaint on record from a woman who had alleged that her home security system had been used for unauthorized surveillance during and after a domestic partnership. The complaint had been difficult to substantiate at the time because the technical evidence required a level of forensic expertise that the investigating agency had not had readily available. The case had not progressed. Leonard had moved to Iowa 18 months after that complaint was filed. In Kansas, there was a restraining order that had expired, taken out by a woman whose name I do not have permission to share, who had cited monitoring and psychological control as the basis for her request. That order had been filed 7 years before he appeared at Patricia Reeves's 4th of July party and looked at me with what I had believed were kind eyes. He had a history. He had a methodology. He had moved it from state to state and home to home, and he had been able to do so because each individual situation was difficult to prove, because the harm was architectural rather than visible, and because the women involved had each, in their own way, struggled to make others understand what a house can become when the person inside it knows how to use information as control. I am telling you this not to frighten you, but to give you the clearest possible understanding of why it matters to take behavioral changes seriously before you have what looks like proof. The proof, when it came, was substantial. But Hannah had been feeling the reality of it for 2 years before the wall opened, and she had been told, in the calm and patient voice of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, that what she was feeling was not real. Let me tell you about the family meeting I did not want to have, because it is part of the story that carries its own important lesson. My son-in-law Daniel, my daughter from my first marriage's husband, is a decent man with a strong preference for things making sense before he acts on them. When I told him and my eldest daughter Carol what had happened, Daniel's first response was to ask whether Leonard had been formally charged yet, and when I told him that the investigation was ongoing and the legal process moved at its own pace, he said, "Marjorie, I just want to make sure we are all seeing this clearly before we say things that cannot be unsaid." I understand why he said that. I am not angry at him for it. But I want to name it as a pattern I have seen described in many situations involving coercive control. The instinct of people who love us to require a formal institutional confirmation before they allow themselves to fully believe what the person closest to the situation is telling them. It is a form of caution that comes from a reasonable place, but it can function as a wall between the person who needs support and the support they need. Hannah did not need Daniel to believe the investigation. She needed him to believe her. Those are different things. Carol believed her sister without requiring that sequence. Carol arrived at Patricia's house on October 24th with groceries and no agenda and sat across from Hannah and said, "Tell me whatever you want to tell me, and I will listen to all of it." And that simple offer, that clean, uncomplicated willingness to receive what Hannah had to say without evaluating its sufficiency as evidence, gave Hannah something she had been missing for 2 years, which was the experience of being believed before she had finished explaining herself. I watched that happen between my daughters, and I felt something restore itself in me that I had not known was broken. Family belief is not an investigation. It does not need to meet a legal standard. It just needs to show up and listen. Detective Alvarez contacted me on November 3rd to let me know that Leonard had been brought in for formal questioning. The memory cards contained recordings that predated his residency at Cedar Mill Road, recordings from a property in Nebraska that matched the address of the woman who had filed the civil complaint. The hard drive contained files that the forensics team was still analyzing. The legal process had begun, and like all legal processes, it would be slow and imperfect, and would produce outcomes that were not fully satisfying, and also not nothing. Leonard was not in my house anymore. That was not nothing. Hannah was sleeping in her own room again, under the garden blanket, with the door open because she chose to leave it open, not because she needed to monitor whether she was safe to close it. That was not nothing either. The evening of November 3rd, After I spoke with Detective Alvarez, I went down to the basement and I stood in front of the shelving unit that swung on its hinge, and I looked at the open wall behind it. Torres's team had photographed and documented everything. The cavity was empty now. The recorder was gone. The cables were gone. The notebook and the hard drive were in an evidence bag somewhere, being read by people whose job it was to understand what they meant. I got Walter's hammer from the workbench and I sealed the wall myself. Not perfectly, not prettily, but I drove the nails in and I plastered over the cavity with the same patching compound I had used on the hallway ceiling, and I smoothed it with a wet knife the way Walter had shown me 40 years ago, and when I was done, the wall was just a wall again. Then I sat down on the basement floor, on the cold concrete, and I let myself cry for the first time since October 17th. Not from grief exactly. From the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent 6 weeks being careful and patient and strategic, and has finally reached a moment where no one needs her to be anything but tired. Hannah came down the stairs 20 minutes later. She did not say anything. She sat down beside me on the floor, and she put her head on my shoulder, and we sat there in the basement for a long time, in the house her father had built with his steady, quiet hands, and outside on the street a car went by, and somewhere 2 houses down a dog barked once and went quiet, and the world was exactly as ordinary as it had been on the morning of October 17th, and also completely different. 6 months passed between the night Hannah woke me in the dark and the morning I am going to tell you about now. 6 months is a strange unit of time. It is long enough for the acute pain of a revelation to soften into something more manageable, and short enough that the body still flinches at small things, a certain tone of voice, a door closing too quietly, the particular silence of a room that has just been left by someone. Healing does not move in a straight line. I learned that in my 20 years of hospital nights, watching patients recover from things that had rearranged them at a fundamental level, and I learned it again in the 6 months after October 17th, watching my daughter learn to trust the sound of her own thinking. I want to begin this last part of the story by telling you what Hannah looked like in April, because I think the small, visible signs of a person reclaiming themselves are as important and as educational as the dramatic moments, maybe more so. She started singing again. Not immediately, not in November or December when we were still navigating the early stages of everything, but in late February she was in the kitchen making the braided bread she used to make when she was processing something difficult. And I was sitting at the table with my coffee, and without any announcement or performance, she started humming. A hymn I recognized from when she was small. She did not seem to notice she was doing it, and I did not point it out, because some things need to be allowed to return without the weight of being observed. By March, she was calling Brenda on Sundays again. I would hear her from the kitchen, not the full words, just the rhythm of the conversation, and then the laugh, the big easy one that starts in the belly, and every time I heard it, I felt something in my own chest loosen by a small degree. A laugh like that is a report from the interior. It means something real is happening in there again. She went back to the garden in April. The tomatoes she had not planted the previous year left the bed weedy and compacted, and she worked it for 3 weekends before she was satisfied with the soil. I watched her from the kitchen window, this woman I had raised and nearly lost, to a silence I had not seen clearly enough or fast enough, crouching in the dirt with her hands buried to the wrist, and I thought about all the conversations that had happened in that kitchen without my knowledge, all the words that had traveled from my own mouth through walls I thought were private. And I thought about the specific mercy of dirt under your fingernails. The way physical work with living things is one of the oldest forms of reorientation the body has. I want to stop here and sit with you for a moment before I tell you the rest, because this final part of the story is the part where the lesson comes fully into the light, and I want you to receive it with me rather than just hear me announce it. If you have been with me from the beginning, from the basement stairs and the hammer and the cold concrete floor, I want you to know that your presence here matters to me more than I can easily say. Tell me where you are watching from today. Tell me what time it is there, morning or afternoon, or the quiet middle of the night. If this story has given you something real, leave a like so I know it reached you. Subscribe if you want another story tomorrow, because there is one here every single day, and every one of them is told for someone who needs it. And if you know someone who is sitting alone right now inside a house that does not feel like their own, please share this with them. You might be the hand they needed without knowing they were waiting for it. I will be right here when you come back. Detective Alvarez called me on a Tuesday morning in early January to give me an update on where the legal process stood. And I want to be honest with you about what that conversation felt like. Because I think honesty about legal outcomes is one of the most important things a story like this can offer. The system is real and the system is limited, and both of those things are simultaneously true. And pretending otherwise would be a disservice to everyone who has ever walked into a police station with a canvas tote of evidence and a summary document and a stomach full of hope. Leonard Voss was charged with unlawful surveillance and unauthorized access to electronic communications. Those charges were real, and they carried real weight. The investigation also opened parallel inquiries in Nebraska, where the woman from the civil complaint, whose name I eventually learned was Sylvia, had agreed to cooperate. There was the possibility of additional charges. There was a legal process underway that would move at its own pace and produce its own outcome, and Detective Alvarez was careful and honest with me about the fact that legal processes involving psychological and technological control are still navigating a landscape where the law is catching up to the methodology. I am not going to tell you that justice arrived perfectly or promptly, because it did not, and any story that told you otherwise would be doing you a disservice. What I will tell you is that Leonard was removed from my house, from my life, and from access to my daughter, and that a legal record existed where before there had been nothing. And I will tell you that Sylvia, the woman in Nebraska, finally had her account in a formal record alongside evidence that corroborated what she had reported years earlier and had not been able to prove at the time. Whatever the legal outcome ultimately was, she was no longer alone with her story. That matters. I believe that matters even when the courtroom does not give you the sentence you needed. Daniel, my son-in-law, came to Cedar Mill Road in December and sat at my kitchen table and said something I want to share with you, because I think it is honest, and because it represents a kind of accountability that does not come easily to people who are careful by temperament. He said, "Marjorie, I asked you to wait for formal charges before I fully believed you. And I understand now that what I was really asking was for you to carry the uncertainty alone until I was comfortable. I am sorry for that." He said it plainly, without performance, and I accepted it plainly, without performance. And we had coffee and talked about Hannah's tomatoes and the practical questions of what the spring was going to look like, and that was enough. Not everything needs a dramatic reckoning. Sometimes accountability just needs a kitchen table and the willingness to say the true thing and then sit with it. Carol had been Hannah's anchor through the winter. She came every other weekend, drove the 2 hours from Des Moines without being asked, brought food and bad films they watched wrapped in blankets on the living room sofa, and functioned as the steady presence that allowed Hannah to have bad days without those bad days feeling like regression. I want to say something about Carol here that I think is important. Carol did not fix anything. She did not solve anything. She did not arrive with a strategy or a plan or a set of recommendations. She arrived with her presence, and she kept arriving, and the consistency of that arrival was itself the healing thing. The lesson is this: when someone you love is rebuilding, you do not need to know what to say. You need to keep showing up. Showing up is a language that does not require words. Hannah started seeing a therapist in November, a woman named Dr. Ferreira, who worked with a practice in Burlington that specialized in trauma and coercive control. I want to mention this carefully because I believe in being precise about the role of professional support. Dr. Ferreira was not a character in our family drama. She was a trained professional who provided Hannah with a space to process her experience with someone who had the clinical knowledge and the appropriate boundaries to do that work safely. She is not mine to describe in detail, but I can tell you that Hannah, who came home from her first appointment quiet and a little stunned, came home from her 6th appointment and stood in the kitchen and said, I am starting to be able to tell my thoughts from the ones that were installed in me. And that sentence, simple as it was, told me that the work was happening. I want to say something about therapy here, not as a prescription, because I am not a doctor and this is not medical advice, but as a grandmother who watched her daughter spend 2 years without a single professional in her corner and then watched what happened when one arrived. People who experience coercive control often struggle with a particular kind of confusion about their own perceptions because a sustained and skillful effort has been made to make them distrust those perceptions. A trained therapist can help a person begin to sort out what belongs to them and what was placed there by someone who had reasons for it. That kind of sorting is not work that love alone can do. Love is necessary. It is not sufficient. And knowing the difference between what love can provide and what professional support can provide is one of the most practical pieces of wisdom I took from everything we lived through. Now let me tell you about the morning in April that I want to end with, because every story needs a moment that holds everything else up the way a single beam can carry a whole roof, and this was ours. It was a Saturday. The light was the particular clean light of an Iowa spring morning, the kind that has no shadows in it yet, just pure white and pale gold coming through every window at once. Hannah was in the garden. I was in the kitchen making biscuits, the kind my mother made, the kind I have been making for 50 years, rolled out on the same wooden board Walter gave me for our first anniversary, because he knew I liked to bake, and he knew that a good board mattered. I could hear Hannah outside through the screen door, not words, just movement, the particular sounds of work being done in good soil. And then I heard something that stopped my hands on the rolling pin. She was singing. Not humming this time. Singing, clearly, and without any apparent awareness that it could be heard. An old song I recognized from when she was 9 or 10 and had gone through a phase of learning every hymn she could find in the church hymnals. Her voice was not beautiful in the technical sense, as I said before, but it had the quality that voices have when they are singing from a place of genuine feeling rather than performance. A slight roughness at the edges that means the sound is coming from somewhere real. I stood at the kitchen window with flour on my hands, and I listened to my daughter sing in the garden she had reclaimed, in the yard of the house on Cedar Mill Road, in the spring light of a morning that had been earned rather than simply arrived at. And the garden blanket was on the chair by the back door, where Hannah had taken to putting it in the mornings before she went outside, so it would catch the early sun and smell warm when she came back in. My mother's blue and yellow flowers, the tiny stitches that had held through 40 years of use and one winter in the dark of a basement shelf, back in the light where it belonged. I want to talk to you now, directly, the way I have been talking to you throughout this story, because we have come a long way together, and the end of a story is the right place to say the things that the story has been building toward. If you are a mother or a grandmother, here is what I want you to carry from Cedar Mill Road. Trust patterns over your need for simple explanations. When someone you love changes in small ways, 1 change is ordinary. 2 is coincidence. 3 is a question you owe them, not an accusation, not an investigation, a question asked with love and with the genuine willingness to hear an answer that might be harder than you expected. I spent too long accepting 1 explanation per change and never laying them side by side. Lay them side by side. That is the work. Do not let someone else become the interpreter of your child at any age. When I look back at the moments when Leonard answered for Hannah, softly and helpfully and with perfect plausibility, I see the moments I should have looked past the answer to the person it came from. Adults who love each other and live together do not need a translator. If someone in your home has become the primary source of information about another person's emotional state, ask yourself why that is and what it serves. Write things down. Not as evidence gathering, not as surveillance of your own family, but as a practice of attention. A dated note that says Hannah did not laugh at dinner tonight is not paranoia. It is a mother paying attention. Over time, notes like that tell a story that individual moments cannot. I wish I had started writing things down the first time I noticed the kitchen going quiet. And please, When you raise a concern, do not raise it alone. I tried to carry what I was noticing inside myself for months before it had enough weight to act on, because I was afraid of being the dramatic one, the worried one, the old woman who reads too much into things. Patricia Reeves changed the trajectory of what happened to my family, not because she had special powers, but because she was present, and she was willing to be a second set of eyes. Find your Patricia. Tell her what you are watching. Let someone else's steadiness hold you while you figure out what you know. If you are someone who has been told that what you are feeling is not real, that your perceptions are the problem, that the discomfort in your own home is a product of your own history rather than your own present, I want to speak to you directly. What you are feeling is data. It does not need to meet a legal standard to be taken seriously by the people who love you. You do not need to have proof before you are allowed to be uncomfortable. You do not need to wait until the harm is visible to the outside world before you ask for help. Start with one person you trust. Tell them one thing. That is enough to begin. Take a breath with me right now. If this story has reached something in you tonight, leave a like. Let me know you are there. Tell me where you are watching from, what city, what state, what time it is where you are sitting. I read those comments the way I used to read the letters that came to the house when I was young, like small pieces of the world arriving to say hello. And if someone you love is in a house that does not feel safe, please share this story with them. Not because a story can do what a professional or a trusted community can do, but because sometimes the first thing a person needs before they can ask for help is the knowledge that what they are living has a name, that others have lived it and come through it. That there is a morning on the other side where the light comes through every window at once and someone is singing in the garden. Subscribe if you have not already. There is a story here every day. Some of them are about big visible troubles, and some of them are about the quiet kind, the kind that happens inside closed doors in houses that look fine from the street. And every one of them is told because someone out there needs it on the day it arrives. I want to tell you one more thing before I close. In the spring, about a month after the garden morning I described, Hannah came to me in the kitchen one evening while I was doing the dishes, and she stood beside me, and she said, "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just hear it without trying to fix it." I turned off the water, and I dried my hands, and I turned to face her, and I said, "I am listening." She said, "I was not just afraid of him, I was afraid of telling you because I had heard my own voice in his version of you and I believed it." And then she said, "I do not believe it anymore. And I need you to know that it was not because you proved him wrong by being perfect. It was because you kept being present, even when I was quiet, even when I did not answer your questions the way you needed me to, even when I took my coffee upstairs. You kept being there, and eventually that was louder than what he said about you." I held my daughter in the kitchen at Cedar Mill Road for a long time that evening. I held her the way you hold someone when you understand that what you almost lost was not a thing, but a world, a whole interior world that had been trying to reach you through the particular frequency of small changes, and the mercy of the situation was that it had not gone too far before you finally found the right wall to open. The garden blanket is on Hannah's bed again, where it belongs, where it has always belonged. My mother's tiny flowers, blue and yellow, carrying the smell of whatever room they are in, carrying the weight of whoever sleeps under them, carrying 4 decades of family forward into mornings that were not guaranteed, but arrived anyway. The house on Cedar Mill Road still has the kitchen window that turns everything gold for 20 minutes before the sun drops behind the Reinhardt property. Still has the floors that creak in the same 3 places. Still has the porch that leans to the left like a tired woman resting her head. It is still mine. It is still ours. And it is clean in a way that it was not before, not in the surface way of swept floors and wiped counters, but in the deeper way, the way of a house that knows what is true inside it, and where nothing speaks through walls that were not built for speaking. If you made it to the end of this story, I want you to know something. You gave a 76-year-old woman from Burlington, Iowa, the gift of being heard. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. Everything I have told you tonight was told because I believe that stories, honest ones, careful ones, the kind that do not pretend the world is simpler than it is, are one of the ways human beings pass wisdom between themselves across the distances that separate us. You and I have never met. I do not know your name, or what your house looks like, or what is sitting quietly in the corners of your life that you have not yet found the right question for. But I know that you stayed. You listened. And listening is where everything begins. Leave a like if this story gave you something to hold. Write the word safe in the comments, because safety begins when somebody finally pays attention. And you paid attention tonight, and that matters. Subscribe so we can sit together again tomorrow, because the stories do not stop, and neither does the need for them. Share this with someone who is carrying something alone that they do not have to carry alone. Tell me where you are and what time it is there. I will read every one of those comments like the postcards they are, from people I may never meet in person, but who I am grateful for in ways that do not require meeting. Take care of the people who trust you. Trust the people who take care of you. And when something in a house goes quiet, listen for what the quiet is saying before you decide it means nothing. From my kitchen on Cedar Mill Road, with flour still on my apron and the sound of my daughter's voice coming through the screen door, I thank you for being here. Come back tomorrow. I will be waiting.